There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel, and I'm delighted to welcome back Hunter from Florida. He's been on my bite-sized book chats once, and here he is for a longer form chat. Hello, Hunter.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's October 26th. What's the temperature in Florida? I can probably take a guess by looking at your outfit, but
Yeah, it is sweltering right now. I don't even know. I'm sure it's actually probably considered pretty cool right now. I can tell you, let's see. It is currently 81.
81, and it's about 30 here in Fahrenheit, -3 in Celsius. So there you go. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, no.
I invited Hunter back because he is a fount of information about all things queer and all things Floridian. So we thought we would focus in on the interstice, is that the right pronunciation for that word, between the two. And he's going to recommend and enlighten us on queer literature from Florida. I'm excited. Hunter, what have you got for us?
You know, it's so funny. So I think so much about literature that comes out of Florida anyway, and I think so much about like how we associate campiness with queerness, and how if you think about like a certain type of Florida, if you think about something like Made for Love by Alissa Nutting, or even her book Tampa, it captures a certain type of Florida that's very tacky, but also very campy and very like drag show feeling almost in its aesthetic. And so I think that Florida fiction in general has a very queer aesthetic in that way. So I don't even think that something has to be, I don't even think it has to be explicitly queer to be just inherently queer. And actually, I think that some of the most interesting queer work, Jeff Vandermeer, he lives in Tallahassee, which is where I live. Don't come murder me, please. He's written some very, I don't know how he identifies, but he writes a lot of queer characters. And the way that he approaches queer characters in a speculative fiction environment in an alternate Florida in a way, I find very fascinating. And I think that's the thing too, is that Florida by its very nature is something that is so bizarre. It's bizarre both politically and in its nature. Lauren Groff talks a lot about this in her work. The people who are coming out of here aren't writing queer characters in a way that feels explicit to the ideas we have around what queer experience is. It's a truer experience of queerness, because the focus is not on the queerness. The focus is on every other aspect of the life, if that makes sense. I think that Kristen Arnett, she wrote a book called Mostly Dead Things that came out several years ago, and then she wrote a book called With Teeth soon after that. And those books are so Florida in such an interesting way, but they feature queer characters. Both books feature lesbian women from Florida, and Mostly Dead Things is about a woman whose father was a taxidermist, and she's taken up the mantle after he dies, and it's about her relationship with her mother. And you have With Teeth, which is a book about two women who are raising a child together and what that looks like. These are really fascinating things, but I think a lot of the queer fiction I read in other areas, I think I don't know, it has like its various, like regional fiction is always going to have different, each one is going to have its own aesthetic that is like tied to what the I think the Minnesota literature looks a certain way, New York literature looks a certain way, California literature looks a certain way. Florida fiction, specifically fiction, is really kind of diving into it's funny because like you would almost say all of it is fantastical magical realism, or something. Just if you read it without knowing Florida, you would just assume it's along that line, but it's not. This is just how the experience is day to day.
So it's a realistic picture of how magically realist Florida experience is.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
And which I don't know, like, have you read like a lot of Florida fiction?
I have not. I'm just looking at the list here. I have not read Kristen Arnett, and I can't think of one that I've read. I have a list here on from Goodreads that it is a queer book set in Florida,
Mhm.
and nothing is jumping out at me that I have read. In fact, very little of it is even familiar to me.
I will say too, that's another thing. I see a lot of books that are set in Florida that are like queer, and I don't think a lot of it doesn't feel the popular ones, the ones that people typically read, or it's very commercial, and I don't read a lot of commercial lit. It's funny because I don't really think that we associate Southern literature with queer literature that often. I think when we think about, I actually like most of the queer stories I read when I was younger took place either in like Middle America or took place in New York. Right. And it was either this big like specifically New York experience, and that's the thing too. I have to clarify that my reading experience up until a couple of years ago was very American centric. So I feel like I've been trying to diversify my reading and read more world literature over the past couple of years, but I definitely think that my understanding of the queer experience was definitely mostly shaped in American literature as a whole, and that is not a reflection of the queer experience, obviously, throughout the world. I think that Southern queer literature as a whole is really interesting. I think that there's certain memoirs too that are I'm looking at my like collection of memoirs now, and I know that anything I list is going to be wrong because like everything like the Southern sphere kind of. I also have to clarify, I'm from Georgia, but I live in Florida, and so I have this weird amalgamation in my head of like, oh, when did I experience this or when did I see this? And they are like Georgia and Florida are two separate things, as is Alabama, as is like North Carolina, Tennessee, but there are certain markers that all kind of like mirror each other in these areas. So it still blurs together a little bit. There is a book, Florida Woman by Deb Rogers. And I read that one, I think last year. And it's definitely, it's queer, but it's like, I don't want to say queer light, but it's like, it's not like as explicit, I guess, maybe. But this is the thing too, is that I feel like we still need to see more of this. I've read books that are smaller presses. I think Catapult had a book called Brutes that came out this past year that is set in Florida. The comparison was the Florida Project meets the Virgin Suicides.
Okay.
Which is, I love, if it's sad, if it is traumatic, I love that. I love something that makes me feel really, like if it makes me question my place in the world, I love that. If I hate myself when I'm done, I love that because I love to hate myself. Like, that's amazing. But I'm trying to think, though. It's so interesting, too, because I also feel like, I don't know if you ever feel like this, but I think so much about, I've done more traveling over the past couple of years, and there are certain aspects to every single place that are kind of the same. Like you're always going to have like these small stores that have the same type of people in them. You're always going to have like the same types of social circles. Like I went to California a couple of years ago, and there were people who were living in the same types of trailers that I grew up in with the same accent that I have. And I was like, what, how are you like this across the country? And I think, and that's, we all like to think that everything is so distinct to us, but it's not. Like we all have these like very common things that are all throughout everywhere.
Some people hypothesize that that's based on social media and television, that accents that are regional, they get people pick them up from TV or whatever. I know that in Atlantic Canada, well, in fact, it's the reverse. In Atlantic Canada, Newfoundland in particular, apparently the Newfoundland accent is disappearing because everybody's watching American TV.
Oh,
so it can go both ways.
Yeah, it's funny because there's certain. I even think about like my own accent and how it shifts and changes over time. Look, when I get nervous, it like the Southern accent, or if I've been drinking, the Southern accent comes out more. Or if I'm talking to my granny, or if I say, so there's a fried chicken place around here called Popeye, or it's called Popeyes, but apparently when I say it, it's like I say Popeyes, but apparently it sounds like I'm saying pie twice, and I'm not. I'm saying what's in my head is pop eyes. Anyway, this is a whole side tangent, but it's like people pick on me for it all the time, but that's where my accent comes out the most, I think. That's something else that's so funny, is that like I also think that queer literature, part of it is trying to subvert certain ideas or certain structures and stuff, and in doing so also tends typically to avoid the really frustrating stereotypes of Southern people or certain colloquialisms and stuff, because they're trying to get to something that's more authentic and honest, and so they're not trying to like fall into certain tropes, ideas, stock characters and such.
I'm curious, how long have you lived in Florida, Hunter?
10 years.
10 years. Okay.
So
So maybe I should ask your other half this question, but how have you changed? In what senses are you Floridian now compared to how you were 10 years ago?
I think it's funny. I think, I love, actually, I used to not really care for the beach. And I can't really say if this is due to Florida or due to CrossFit, but I do enjoy going to the beach much more now than I used to.
Well, I've kind of noticed that. If anybody, I do follow you on Instagram.
Yeah, I think, well, that's the thing. I think everyone's like, oh, like, does he live at the beach? And I'm like, no, 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 no. It's just a 2-hour drive, which is not that far for a lovely day, on the sand. But so I think that's one thing. I think living in the South in general, and going back to queer literature, I think the queer Southern literature often shows how we have to negotiate this, is this idea of you're surrounded, especially Florida is a place that has, politically speaking, very blue spots and very red spots, and you're kind of having to negotiate and navigate being around a very diverse group of people politically, people who believe completely different than you, people who do not agree with your life or who you are, your very essence, and you're having to figure out how to negotiate that. And I think that that complicated dynamic is something that's really captured well in especially books like, I think With Teeth is a book that I think about all the time. Actually, it's I have, look, so good to have both With Teeth and Mostly Dead Things. She also has a short story collection that's really good. Another queer, well, no, she's not queer, but I think her work is queer, is Karen Russell. And people will disagree with me. I will have dissenters because there's nothing explicitly queer about her work. However, I claim that the gaudy, like I said, campy aesthetic of certain things, I think that the richness, Karen Russell her writing reminds me a lot of Alexander Chee's work in certain ways, in this almost like Baroque, very like rich, overly detailed. Like there's no reason for some of the details that are in her work, but it's so necessary for the style of it all. Like I think sometimes we kind of go towards ornate literature, but at the same time, sometimes we love people who dress with really gaudy jewelry and have like these like big bouffant hairdos, and like, are you going to say to a drag queen you're wearing too much makeup? Probably not. And I think
Probably not.
Right. And so I think sometimes certain types of literature, they're like, certain stories and novels are like drag queens. Like, is it so much? Is it so extra? Of course it is. But that is like the very nature of the work. That's what it's demanding of itself. And I think that Florida literature, especially, it's Florida literature lives in the contradictions, right? Because like you have a lot of there's a lot of like actually very like specific queer spaces in Florida, like while trying to navigate this very like conservative lane. And I think so much about like the idea of like pink flamingos in the yard, which they do exist. Miami is real, but I think that Florida literature literally mirrors that. And I also think about books like Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a classic. Zora Neale Hurston, and
yes.
that book to me feels like okay. And I should also clarify, I just read last year, I read The Count of Monte Cristo. That book is not queer. I was convinced that the Count was a drag queen the entire time. He loves costumes, he loves the theater, he loves the drama, he's a gossip. He sounds so much like me that I was like, you've got to be at least a little bit of the Homa. I'm convinced.
Gaydar was rapidly firing.
Yeah. And so I guess that's my example of saying I project queerness onto everything. So I don't know if I'm like the best person to talk to about this, but at the same time, I also just think that we don't recognize how queer everything is that we're engaging with half the time.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. So, if you can remember, what was it that set off your gaydar about Their Eyes Were Watching God?
I think that there were just certain moments I can't remember the protagonist's name, but I just remember that. I just remember there was something about the way that Hurston writes about her identity that the way that she engages with herself that reminded me of certain elements of the queer experience and of this splintering of the self in a way. And I think that is, I think so much, like, there's this saying about like how the queer experience is you spend all these years like parceling yourself out to different people to like create various versions of yourself, right, to be loved. And then the next phase of your life is figuring out what is me and what is the thing I was trying to hide or to become to please other people. And I think that, and I also think that that kind of thing happens a lot. I don't think it's inherent, just specific to queer people, but I do think that most queer people recognize that experience. And I saw that in Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it was something that resonated with me. But I also think that when there's limited access to explicitly queer literature, that we often are seeking out similar experiences that we can identify with.
Absolutely. Their Eyes Were Watching God is my favorite American novel. It's one of the most beautiful works of literature I've ever read. Oh my God.
No, that's a thing though. There's it's so funny because, I think we often think about New York as this like the epicenter of American fiction in a way, but there's so much, I think Southern literature as a whole is just a wellspring of just so much stuff. And also I think that if you read books like Flannery O'Connor, who's a very divisive person, I think that a lot of her work in certain ways feels avoidant of certain sexual ideas. And I think that's intentional because I think there was a discomfort there that to people I grew up, like a lot of the older women I grew up with who were maybe around the age of Flannery O'Connor, I think that I saw those people who later would admit having certain like queer feelings of that they identified with certain elements of queerness, having enjoying another person's company and certain things that they would say that made me wonder is this what queer literature looks like at a certain time in a certain place? Was this hiding certain elements of yourself in the text? I don't know. Okay.
So who are some other writers you'd like to tell us about, or other books?
Well, she's not living in Florida anymore, but she was living in Florida up until recently, is Dantiel Moniz, who wrote Milk, Blood, Heat, which is a short story collection that I loved. I think it was a National Book Award 5 under 35 book back in like 2021, maybe. But right. I think that short story collection, it's so funny. She was inspired by Janet Fitch's Oleander, which is not a Florida book, but it has a very rich language. It's set in California. It's a beautiful book. But Milk, Blood, Heat is one of those books that it explores a lot of different. This is one of those books where I don't know if I think maybe only like one or two of the stories explicitly say anything about queerness, but I think it is deeply exploring ideas of identity in ways that are inherent to the queer experience. And they're also so specific to Florida. I think that she is one of the few writers who captures the beauty of nature in Florida. And also there's something so sickly sweet about the people here. That's not a bad thing at all, but but there's just people here don't know how to be cruel sometimes without adding in that little bit of like something nice on the end. Just they're trying to like cut the edge of their meanness in some way, which is a very Southern thing. And so I think
bless his heart type of thing.
Yeah, that is definitely, I think it's that's actually such a real thing here, is this that people do this all the time. But I think she captures that. And I think there's so much that I love about that collection. She's working on a novel now that I think is going to be great. She also writes about masculinity in ways that I find really interesting. I love whenever women write about masculinity, because I think that they're so often having a conflict with toxic masculinity or they have partners who can sometimes be masculine or not, and the way that they're negotiating that is really interesting to me. Going back to like nonfiction, there are several great memoirs to come out of here, but there's Jaquira Díaz, who wrote Ordinary Girls, and Kira Madden, who wrote Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls.
That's right.
And I think that the experience of specifically being like a queer teenage girl in Florida is really interesting to me. I have not had that experience, obviously, but I think that there's something so weird about the relationship that girls and women have in the South, where it's like people often associate a lot of Southern things with manners and a certain type of upbringing. And so I think men really know how to really creepily toe that line of being very inappropriate while also like hiding it behind certain manners. And I think especially if you're a queer person, that you're not really receptive to those things already, and then you have someone doing it in a very devious way, but like hiding it under the guise of politeness. I see a lot of that in a lot of the memoirs I read in that way. And I think that's really interesting to read about because people just don't talk about it as much like in real life or like in the world, day-to-day conversation. But I also just think that in the same way that with everything, like these writers are capturing the experience of living in a place that feels like walking into an old man's hot mouth, like that is truly what it feels like to live in Florida a lot of the time. And so basically it's so rich with an outer world and with the politics. Like there's so much there. There's just so much to play with, I guess.
Well, I'm very interested in this image. I'm almost scared to ask you to elaborate on it, but I'm going to stepping into an old man's hot mouth. Can you say more about that?
So Florida, outside of maybe December and January, Florida is pretty much always blazingly hot, and it's also it's a very wet heat, and so it truly. If you ever want to know what it feels like to be in Florida, if you just stick your finger in your mouth and you just breathe really heavily, it feels a little bit gross, a little bit wet, very warm. That is how it feels all over your body when you're outside. And if you have no air conditioning in your car, which I currently do not, it is just insufferable. You constantly feel like you're being like baked, but like not in a fun way. And so that's unfortunate, but it's interesting though. So yeah, so I think that there's just like this feeling of like constantly being sticky and uncomfortable. And that's the thing too, is that Florida, the experience just of being in Florida is always a little uncomfortable because you're always a little sticky, a little too hot, a little too you're always feeling a little uncute, not cute because you've got pit stains and all these things and your back's all sweaty and you're like, ugh, and your hair is frizzing up or it's falling down. Your makeup's melting off, and that just happens at all times.
Now, we have got this far into the conversation without really touching too much on politics, but in the era of your current governor, I'm imagining that it's even more challenging to be a queer writer in Florida. Do you have any comments on current political situation?
It's interesting because I'm friends with a lot of teachers here, and and people want to act like, oh yeah, they're not, but I have a friend who's a librarian who has talked about the way that even the idea alone of readers not having as much access to certain things. There are certain books that I've tried to request from the library that we cannot get now in the public library. And so people want to act like things aren't being that this is not really having a greater effect, but it is. And I think that it's hard because I think that one of the reasons why we find so many impassioned writers is because this rage begets some of this art that demands revolution. But at the same time, we no one wants to have to go through all that just to make art, right? We want to be able to be at peace enough to it's tough because on the one hand, it is fostering a certain passion for change, but on the other hand, I wonder what art we would get if we weren't constantly feeling this need to demand, just respect for our lives.
It's important work, important literature, and the milieu that it emerges out of is something that you have described inimitably well. Thank you so much for that. And do you have anything else you'd like to add before we close?
I guess all I will say is that if you have not had a chance to consider the queer canon of Florida, that you do, and if you have more insight than I do, then please let us know, because I would love to talk more about other books that I did not discuss today.
Absolutely. You've given us a whole bunch to start with, and there might be a few readers out there that'll leave some other suggestions in the comments below, but this was an absolute delight. Hunter, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.